Have you ever been enamored by something you've never seen? For me, it was the Blackiston's fish owl. These are owls as large as eagles. Disheveled masses of wood-chip brown feathers, electric yellow eyes, and ear tufts long and floppy like leaves of a fern. They live in some of the hardest-to-reach forests of Northeast Asia, where they nest in huge holes in centuries-old trees and pluck salmon from rivers. They are symbols of true wilderness. In the year 2000, I saw a fish owl in the Russian province of Primoria, not far from where Russia, China, and North Korea meet in a tangle of mountains and barbed wire. It turned out that no scientist had seen one so far south in 100 years. The photographs I took were evidence that this rare, reclusive species still existed there. Within a few years, fish owls had taken over my life. Knowing that logging, poaching, and other threats were loosening the owl's fragile hold on Primoria, I started a program with Russian scientists to look for more of these birds. We found and studied them, enduring blizzards and floods, and near misses with tigers and bears, to learn what we could to protect the owls from extinction. This book is that story.
Jonathan, добрый вечер. Как вы поживаете?
Добрый вечер. Ну, все хорошо. А у вас?
Очень хорошо. And that probably is the extent of my remembered Russian from Stanford, but nonetheless, I can, at the end, I can say spasiba, and thank you. But in any case, how wonderful. This is such an exciting program for us. There are lots of grand books coming out about the natural world. And certainly the Blackiston owl, which I have to be honest, I never heard of until your book came along, is a wonderful example of that. So for those of you watching, I wanted to say that we can send you a PDF which will have a photo of the Blackiston owl and of an adorable little owl that I found in Wales at an owl sanctuary in a castle. And the contrast between them is wonderful. So if you order the book, we'll be happy to email that to you. So Jonathan, you have a fascinating career. Are you going to give us a kind of talk with slides for a little while here?
Yep, that's what I have. Although honestly, after watching that video, that kind of summarizes everything in a minute and a half. But yeah, I do have a talk that's about 20 minutes long that I can give. That gives the sort of the background behind the book and give information about the owl and the project that went into the story. Okay. Okay. So again, thank you very much, Barbara, and to the Poison Pen. It's one of the silver linings, I think, of COVID-19 is the ability to magically appear in different parts of the country and have these audiences that are sometimes global. So that is nice. Yeah, so the Blackiston's fish owl is an owl that is probably unlike any that you've known. These are truly large birds. They stand about as tall as a fire hydrant. They weigh nearly the equivalent of 4 great horned owls in North America, or 11 crows. And they have these 6-foot wingspans. So there's these giant birds. Now, to give you some context about where this story takes place, Russia's a big country, and this takes place way down here. This little sort of sliver of Russia that's kind of tucked into Northeast Asia between China, North Korea, and Japan down there. It's a province called Primorsky Krai, or Primoria, and it's largely mountainous. There are about 2 million people that live there. 1 million are concentrated here in the city of Vladivostok. And the rest of the province is largely dotted with small villages like this one. This is Ternay, where my field work is based out of. There are about 3,000 people here. But most villages in the northern part of the province, populations are measured usually just in the hundreds. Overall, Primoria is mountainous. These are the Sichatealine Mountains. And I think it's important just to, before I tell you about the owl and the story that goes into the book, some context about the landscape. The coastline here is just fantastic. I think this image here is not something that many people associate with Russia. Sandy beaches, clear water. But it's really a lovely part of the world. And there are these rivers that snake through the valleys that are teeming with salmon. This is probably the famous resident of Primoria, among wildlife there. This is the Amur, also called the Siberian tiger. One of the other big animals there is the brown bear. Now, this is the only place in the world where you have brown bears and tigers living in the same forests. They do interact, and they do sometimes kill each other. So in the year 2000, I was in the Peace Corps. I was down here in a little village called Lazo. And this is where I saw my first Blackhussen's fish owl. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to read from just the very first paragraph of the book, which describes that first encounter. I saw my first Blackhussen's fish owl in the Russian province of Primoria, a coastal talon of land hooking south into the belly of Northeast Asia. This is a remote corner of the world, not far from where Russia, China, and North Korea meet in a tangle of mountains and barbed wire. On a hike in the forest there in 2000, a companion and I unexpectedly flushed an enormous and panicked bird. Taken to the air with labored flaps, it hooted its displeasure, then landed for a moment in the bare canopy, perhaps a dozen meters above our heads. This disheveled mass of wood-chipped brown regarded us warily with electric yellow eyes. We were uncertain at first which bird, actually, we'd come across. It was clearly an owl, but bigger than any I'd seen, about the size of an eagle, but fluffier and more portly, with enormous ear tufts. Backlit by the hazy gray of a winter sky, it seemed almost too big and too comical to be a real bird, as if someone had hastily glued fistfuls of feathers to a yearling bear, then propped the dazed beast in the tree. Having decided that we were a threat, the creature pivoted to escape, crashing through the trees as its 2-meter wingspan clipped the lattice of branches. Flakes of displaced bark spiraled down as the bird flew out of sight. And so these are the photographs I took of that bird in 2000. And I wasn't even sure it was a fish owl, to be honest, when I first saw it. But fish owl it was, and that sort of started this 20-year fascination with these birds. Now there are a few things that separate fish owls from normal owls, things that make them a little more bizarre than a typical owl. Now, if we look at some other owl species, these are spotted owls. It's the great horned owl. These are barn owls. One thing that all these species share is this very, very distinct facial disc, right? You see that pattern around their face. So what these feathers do is channel sound directly to their ear holes, which gives them really acute hearing. Barn owls, the ones at the bottom there, can even hunt in complete black darkness. Now, if we look at a fish owl's face, it's got a little bit of a facial disc, but nowhere nearly as defined as some of these other species. Another characteristic commonly attributed to owls is silent flight. And the way they do that is by having these, if you look at this flight feather here of a Eurasian eagle owl, the top there has all these comb-like protrusions sticking off of it. And so what happens is when the owl flaps, those little protrusions dissipate the air and essentially act like a cloaking device, so the owl is silent. Fish owls don't have that, so they're almost loud when they fly. And if you think about the reasons for this, fish owls are hunting aquatic prey in noisy rivers. So where a barn owl is trying to quietly sneak up on a mouse that's flitting around in the understory, fish don't care if an owl is flapping around. They can't hear it anyway. And I think the owl would go crazy if it had hypersensitive hearing near that really loud river. And so over time, the owls have simply lost that particular adaptation. There are two things that fish owls need to survive. They need to have these really, really big trees to nest in, and they need to have water that doesn't freeze in winter so they can access their aquatic prey. Now, these birds are non-migratory, so if you think about a bird that lives at a place where it reaches the -30s, most waterways freeze in winter. And so there's certain parts of certain rivers, for example, this one, where there's a radioactive radon hot spring nearby. And so some of that slightly warmer gas seeps into the river channel and keeps this patch reliably ice-free year in and year out. And so this is a spot where fish owls use as their territory. Now, over history, for certainly the last several hundred years, there haven't been many problems for the owls and these resources. There have been plenty of big trees. There have been plenty of fish. 100 years ago, these are indigenous Udege from Primoria. They hunted fish owls. They caught them, especially in the autumn when they put on these thick fat reserves. So it was a nice fatty bird to eat. And they would spread out their tails and wings as for fans. But it wasn't a serious population threat to the birds. And then even in the Soviet Union, there wasn't much pressure. So this map here is from the northern part of Primoria, showing just one county, Ternay County, and the road network in 1984, so getting toward the end of the Soviet Union. Now, fast forward 20 years, suddenly we went from less than 150 miles of road to nearly 3,000 miles of road. And so, fish owls live all through here. And so they went from having no human pressure and no human contact to suddenly some significant pressure and contact. And so there's this sudden emergence of threats, but because the species is so poorly known, the Russian government hasn't really been able to put together a conservation plan. So this was the genesis of the project and of the book and of my PhD from the University of Minnesota. I connected with these two guys. They're both Sergeys, Sergei Avdeyuk and Sergei Surmush, who had been working for about a decade before me to look for fish owls in the region. And so what we decided was that we would work together to find fish owls, catch fish owls, put little GPS units on their backs attached by a backpack, and see where these birds go, see what they do, and then use that information to develop a conservation plan to protect them. So the project, and so these are now things that happen in the book. The project was broken into three parts. The first part was a 2-week trip to a very remote place. You could only get there by helicopter, so the roads hadn't quite reached that far north in Primoria, and it was just nuts for me. You can't really see my face, but I'm in the back porthole there looking out as I'm arriving in Agzu. So we worked as a team of 4. We had 2 snowmobiles with as much gear as we could cram onto those snowmobiles. All the food, you can see a fuel barrel there, and skis, and just pushed off along the river looking for fish owls. Where possible, we stayed in hunter cabins, which was nice because that gave a nice dry and warm place to sleep. And really, we were going along the river looking for owls. And for me, this is a training exercise in learning how to search for owls. And there were 3 things that we looked for. The first was tracks along riverbanks. So if we ever saw one of these open patches of water and wondered if a fish owl might hunt there, we'd go down and look for tracks. This is one of the reasons that all the work described in the book takes place in winter, because that's when it's easiest to detect these owls, to find the owls. Another thing we looked for was feathers clinging to branches. Fish owls are always releasing these feathers that can be, these semi-plumes that can be up to this long, that really stick to branches. And so if you see one of those, that's a good indication that it might be a fish owl nearby. And again, winter, it's obviously much easier to see feathers on bare branches than a feather on in a forest that's fully leafed out. And the last thing, if you ever saw a tree, go up and try to see if there's a fish owl nest in there. So this was the whole period. This whole 2-week period was, like I said, it was pretty intense, and it turned out it ended up really being a race against time to get down this frozen river because there were no roads and make it to the coast before all the ice melted. We got to one point where we couldn't go back upriver to a village because the ice was cracked. It was now flowing water, and we weren't sure that going forward was safer, but we had to push forward because there was no alternative. So the second phase of the project was a several-month period where Sergei and I, Avdeyuk, went to places where he had seen fish owls before, just to see if there were still owls there, and maybe to see if those were owls we could try to capture the next year. So here I am with a friend of Sergei's named Volva at his hunting cabin. And so in 2007, winter 2007, Sergei and I went back to these places to try to catch fish owls. And it was, I would say, this was one of the lower points of my life. We spent just weeks out in the woods trying to find these owls, trying to catch these owls, living in these tents at -30. And I remember, one night we're in this tent, just laying there trying to stay warm, and it was so cold that ice had formed inside the tent, and anytime you would shift a little bit, it would rain these little slivers of ice down onto our faces, which was the only thing exposed, sticking out of our sleeping bags. So it was pretty. For a while there, it was pretty unpleasant. And then we found this guy. This guy's named Anatoly. He's a hermit who'd lived in the woods for about a decade at this point. And we were sort of squatting in this abandoned hydroelectric station along a river. And he invited us to stay with him. And we were looking for owls. We were trying to capture owls near him anyway. And so he's like, look, I've got an extra room. You guys bring the food. I'll cook your food, give you a warm place to stay. So we ended up staying at Anatoly's cabin for a few different winters. And really, he was fairly idiosyncratic, but a really wonderful, generous host. And he was we were really glad that we connected with him. There's his little cabin there. But it took months for us to catch our first bird, and no one had caught adult fish owls in the wild before. So we were working on trial and error, and much of what we were doing was relatively far from a human settlement. So we were really just on our own. We had a book on different capture techniques. We had a bunch of different raw materials that we could reconfigure in different kinds of traps. So we tried different things, but it was I would say it was a very unpleasant experience. At one point we were literally stranded at Anatoly's cabin for I think it was 17 days. We were driving there and got caught in a blizzard and had to leave the truck about 1.5 kilometers from his cabin and walk the rest of the way. And then we were just stuck there till we went back to the road and dug the car out. And field work in Primorje in general it's very labor intensive. If you want water, you take a bucket and you go down to the river and you get water. If you want food, if you want fish, cut a hole in the ice, dip in your line. You want to cook food, dig out a hole in the snow and start a fire. And so a lot of the genesis of the book, so the early drafts, the early texts that came out of the book, really developed from my field notes from this time. So I was speaking Russian the whole time I was here. And so carving out a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour each day to be able to put in some earplugs and just think in English and write down my thoughts, not just the scientific notes, but problems with colleagues or troubles we were having. Just write all these things down and be able to express myself fully in my own language was cathartic, and that was really the genesis of the book. And then at one point, everything clicked. Our capture methodology suddenly worked. We kept trying slightly different things, and suddenly it worked, and we got the capture formula right. And it was right before the end of the season. So once the snow melts and the river, the ice melts, it becomes much more difficult to catch fish owl. So you really have to do it in winter. And so right on the cusp of spring was when we started to catch these birds. And we ended up catching 4 of them our first year. And I mean, I think 3 was in a week or something. It was really quite quick. They were able to get all these birds from different territories. And so here you can barely make out one of the GPSs on the bird's back. So it's about about that size. And again, it's very, very light and attached like a backpack. So what this thing does is takes 1 or 2 GPS locations a day, and then we catch the same bird a year later to download the data and then understand where it went for that year. So after the first year, we expanded the scope of our work. We pushed further into the woods, deeper, and mostly we were living in this truck. This is a GAZ 66, which is pretty durable. It can go lots of places, and there's a 2-room custom-made little cabin on the back there with you can see the wood stove pipe coming out the top. And so over the next few years, there was a sort of revolving cast of characters. So it was always me and Sergei Avdyuk, and then some of these other guys would come in for sometimes just for a few weeks, sometimes for a full season, sometimes for a season and a half, to help us out. Now, 5 people in a small truck might sound comfortable and convenient, but it was a tight space. It got stinky. I mentioned these radon hot springs earlier. Those are really the only places to bathe, and I didn't want to spend too much time in radioactive water. So, it was tempers occasionally flared in this tight space. And I also want to note that, sort of as an aside, I was kind of leading a double life. So I'm over in Russia for the winter, and then, I pop back to Minnesota for a couple months where I do normal things like go bowling and get married. And then next thing I know, I'm back in a truck with the same guys doing the same stuff. So it was a weird double life there for a while. And I also want to underscore how on our own we were for this work. This picture here was 80 kilometers from the closest human settlement. And, the wheel came off. And, I don't know how to put that back on, but thankfully Sergei Avdyuk did. And, I was very, very lucky to be working with him because there's no AAA. You can't, if you don't fix that wheel yourself, I don't know what you're going to do. So Sergei was constantly fixing that pickup truck. He was constantly fixing the GAZ 66. Because again, if it's not fixed, it's not going anywhere, and you're staying there until it is fixed. And another thing, so random people would randomly stop by and just not knock on the door. Hunters or these kids were just kind of out for a joyride, and want to come in and see who we were and chat. And even if the timing was bad, there were times where we had, we were about to trap birds, or we were busy, and locals came by and wanted to talk. They wanted to visit. We couldn't really say no. We had to be gracious. We had to, be nice to the locals because these were the only people around. So if in the future we did have some trouble, if our truck fell through the ice and we need somebody with a winch to get us out, if we had just offended those guys and said, get out of here, we're busy, they would not have stopped to later help us get a truck out. So, and I think so. The book, I think, tries to not just focus on the owls, but really also describe a lot of the social interactions and just kind of the nuts and bolts that go into trying to do a project like this in a remote area. So a question that I get a lot is, who cares? Why does this all matter? Like, why should people in the United States care about what happens with owls in Russia? So remember that map that I showed you earlier of the road network extending into Ternay County? So this is one of those roads that you can see a dirt road kind of crossing this river here, this frozen river. Now, most of these roads they're there for resource extraction. They're not really leading to villages. There's a few villages up there, but mostly the roads are there so people can bring out wood. They're there so that people people go to catch fish. And so a lot of the wood that's actually harvested in Primoria, it ends up in foreign markets. So some of this wood becomes floors in North America. It becomes floors in Europe. The roads provide access for fishermen. Unfortunately, it provides access to a lot of poachers. There are organized poachers who go in to harvest the red caviar, the salmon roe from these fish. But there's legal fishing too, and this fish is sold all across Asia. So, and just this weekend, there was an article in the New York Times about a salmon collapse, the salmon population collapse in Khabarovsky Krai, which is just the province north of Primoria, and that's leading to social unrest in the province. And so what happens here in Primoria has implications that are broader than just there. It impacts the country of Russia and it impacts the world. So this map here shows some of the data that we collected from fish owls. So each of these, there's 4 different colors, and each dot represents a GPS location from an owl. And so you can see right away that all the fish owls are in the valleys, which is the same place that all those roads are. And so this is exactly how we can use science to guide conservation. So what can we do with this that works for both people and for owls? So the first thing, so this was a result from my PhD, was to create a map of the whole region that showed the best possible areas for fish owls. And then we gave this information to the dominant logging company. So now they know where fish owls are, where the best habitat is, and where they should harvest trees and where they should not harvest trees, where they should put roads, where they should not put roads. And so now, because before the project we did not have the data for this kind of conservation plan, and now we do. Another thing that we're working on with the logging company is to block access to some of those roads that are no longer needed by the logging company. They put the roads in, and once they do, then poachers can get up there and shoot tigers, put nets for salmon that fish owls drown in. So by selectively blocking off some of these roads with these huge mounds of dirt, they're protecting the habitat that way. And then another thing that's come out of this project is the understanding that there are really few fish owl nest trees available, because they need these trees that are 300 years old. And so with Sergei and I started, once we realized that there were some territories where there were owls that no longer had big enough trees to breed in, so they weren't breeding, we put some barrels in trees. And we've had owls actually find these barrels and start breeding in these barrels. So this one tree here, they've now had three chicks hatch and fledge out of this box that we just put up in a tree. So the results that have come out of the project that's described in the book has been very satisfying for me as a wildlife conservationist. I mean, like many professions, what we do is filled with uncertainty. We can spend our entire lives designing studies, collecting data, and using that information to guide conservation. But sometimes it's hard to know if what we're doing is having any impact. So knowing that right now, there are fish owls flapping around Primoria because Sergei and I strapped barrels to trees. That because we work with loggers to reduce the harm of their industry. Because we're limiting some road access to areas important for fish owls. It feels good. It gives me hope, and it gives hope for the future of an endangered species. Although I must say that the fish owls do not always appreciate our efforts. Thank you.
Oh, Jonathan, that was marvelous.
Thank you.
I can see you sitting there for a period every day trying to switch out of Russian where you really have to be to communicate and to work and go back into English. That's a hard thing to do, isn't it? Because it's not just the language itself, it's all the cultural references and, frame of mind. So many things are different. Russian's
Absolutely.
a tough language. I mean, I studied it for 2 years, and it's just changing alphabets, so that things that are assigned meaning in our alphabet are assigned a different meaning in the Cyrillic alphabet. Even that's
Right.
difficult. So
Yeah.
it was. Do you think you were ever in danger of losing English?
Oh, but no, by no means, no. And it's funny, the Russians took advantage of me being from another culture sometimes. I mean, as you may know, that Russians have a lot of superstitions, and one of them is once you leave a house, for example, you can't go back. You can't cross that threshold again. That's bad luck. So there'll be times where we'll leave an apartment and someone will be like, I forgot my keys. John, you go back and get my keys. You can do it because you're not Russian. I feel like the Russians had fun with me being there too.
So you were living off the land, clearly, in terms of doing fishing and so forth. But what was your food supply chain for some of these long winters?
Yeah, we would bring with us just absolutely enormous sacks of staples like rice and potatoes and cabbages and flour and pasta. And for protein, largely fish or get meat from some of our local contacts there. Because especially because we kept going back to the same places year in and year out, we did develop a strong network of local hunters who knew us and would help us out when we needed help, and we would help them out when they needed it. And one thing they would do is give us fish and give us meat.
Well, how did the radioactive hot springs become radioactive?
Well, it's just radon, so it's what's in all, I'm in a basement now. There's probably radon here. It's just one of these things. It's just a natural deterioration of whatever that releases the radon gas. So it's naturally occurring, and that just happens to be a place where there's a number of the sources that leak right into waterways.
So what did they do for a drinking supply for you? Was it safe for you to dip water out of the river?
Yeah, we could just go to another spot on the same river. But the Russians consider these radon hot springs to be therapeutic. So people would go. I didn't see many people in winter, but in summer, people would go to those same places and spend a week or two there. They'd spend 15, 20 minutes sitting in the radioactive water, then leave, do something else, and do that 2 or 3 times a day over a week or two. So people sought these things out and used them.
Wow, sort of a spa. I love it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I've traveled a lot in Japan, and since it's on the Ring of Fire, there are enormous numbers of hot springs called onsen.
Yeah.
And
the onsens, yeah.
I've always thought that of all the countries I have visited, Japan is the cleanest. I mean, they are serious sanitation. I'm really grateful to the Toto company for their amazing improvements in home sanitation. But I can imagine that in a place like Primoria, that, as you say, it wouldn't be all that easy to stay clean anyway. So having a hot springs, and also if it's so cold, it's good for your bones. I often think that about Britain. The Romans in Bath, for example, established Bath because they could go and soak in the hot springs in Bath, which must have been enormously comforting and therapeutic for people living in what was at that point a brutally cold climate in Britain.
Yeah, right. And in later years because I still do this work with fish owls, so later it's outside the time frame of the book. We started bringing a mobile sauna with us to be able to stay warm and bathe in a comfortable environment rather than just be cold all the time. And even so, the Radioactive hot springs, they were only slightly warmer. The water wasn't freezing, but it wasn't hot. So it wasn't that fun, in addition to being radioactive.
I'm sure your comment about smell was a good one. It's hard to feel good about yourself when you know you absolutely stink, Lord.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So I have a couple of questions about owls, but let me ask Patrick if he has any questions that have come in.
I just got one. Let's see. Okay, I have a gentleman here who just sent a question in, and he says, I realize that this is hundreds of miles from the Siberian Arctic with the record heat. Are you seeing warming trends in your study area, and is it affecting owl health? That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I haven't been there for a while because of COVID, and that's something that I just haven't had my finger on that pulse. So I don't know how the owls are now. I mean, the Sergeys, Sormich and Abdiuk, they just spent some time looking for owls in April, and I was supposed to be part of that trip as well until COVID. And they were reporting what seemed like normal temperatures and normal owl densities. So at least so my guess would be as far south as Primoria is in relation to the Arctic, that's probably okay right now. Generally speaking, I do think climate change can be problematic. In spring, when all the snow melts and then water levels rise and the water is really, really turbid and murky, fish owls they're not catching fish. What they're catching is all these frogs that show up in all these ephemeral ponds throughout the floodplain forest, and they seem to tie their breeding and the emergence of their chicks with that. And so frogs are very sensitive to climate change. And so if we start to see some of these shifts with when the frogs appear, that could be really bad for fish owls because they'll have their young ready to go, ready for all these frogs to eat, but the frogs aren't there. The fish owls can't catch up as quickly to that change as the frogs can. So that's a real problem that is on my radar.
So owls are tremendous hunters, as you pointed out. They are assisted by their faces that channel their hearing. I'm trying to remember, don't they have some extraordinary swivel power with their necks?
Yeah, I forget how many degrees, but yeah, some owls can go almost all the way around.
Right.
It's pretty incredible.
I've been to an owl sanctuary on the Columbia River, and while I would hesitate to identify the actual owls that we saw, they did have an almost 360-degree rotation. We had an owl in our neighborhood that came and lived on a streetlight and wiped out all the local small birds. We had a flock of lorikeets and so forth, and the owl just decimated them. And then when the food source was gone, it disappeared. It also went after rabbits. So, the fish owl, I can see why it fascinates you, but, it's there's a whole pyramid, right, of predators. And where does the owl stand normally in that pyramid? Up near the top?
Yeah, I think pretty high. I mean, birds, raptors that get as big as fish owls do typically have few predators. And that's why, the first time or when we started catching these birds, we didn't know how they were going to react in the hand. And they turned out to be really calm. And I think that's because they were so surprised to actually be caught by something and held by something that they just, kind of stood there almost, sat there almost in shock. And so from my knowledge, there have only been 2 cases of fish owls being killed by something other than a human. And it was a lynx caught one as it was hunting along a river, and a black bear climbed up into a nest and ate one there. But that's it out of all the records that I found. So you might say that they essentially have no natural predators.
Did you see, I thought it was absolutely wonderful, the little video about the bald eagle that took down a drone the other day?
Yeah.
I love that. I mean, the drone is up there and the eagle goes, not on my watch, crash. And so I wonder, because eagles are such extraordinary predators. I've seen many of them in Alaska. Would it be possible to move the fish owl north in a concerted effort if it becomes too warm in Primoria? I mean, it'd have to
Well,
be a human engineered
they
effort, probably.
they extend. So Primoria is the southern part of their range. They actually go pretty far north, but the populations dwindle. I mean, the densities are presumably much lower on the subarctic, essentially. If you're familiar, there's the Primoria's down here, then there's the Sea of Okhotsk coast, and then Kamchatka. So they're all along that sea, which is really hard to get to. And so we know there are fish owls up at the top because there are researchers up top of the Sea of Okhotsk. We know they're at the bottom where we are, but that intermediary area we're not sure, just because it's so expensive to get there. And it's like $40,000 just to get to one place to see if there's fish owls. And so we haven't actually gone to see. So they do go pretty far north right now.
So it would seem to me that their biggest danger would be if the fish dry up, if the climate changes such that the salmon don't run, and if the frogs
Yep.
don't hop. Then if their food chain is compromised, that would be extremely difficult for them.
Yeah, and again, so that article from this weekend from the New York Times talking about the salmon population crash. I mean, that's a huge problem for fish owls. I mean, that's that's a major part of their food. And so that fish owls can live far away from humans, but if all the fish are being caught right at the river mouth and the fish are not allowed to make it all the way up to where the owls are,
Sorry, so it's not just climate change; it's poachers also.
Unsustainable resource use, right? So cutting down too many trees, and catching more fish than will allow the populations to rebound naturally.
So, I mean, it's a variation on the Amazon. If you want to go to a different climate extreme, it works the same way.
Yeah.
Patrick, is there another question?
Yeah. Scott asks, what are the major gaps still remaining in our understanding of fish owl ecology and conservation? And are there any new research projects in development?
Good question. There are, very, very little is still known. I mean, that's one of the benefits of doing this for a PhD project for me was, when I was looking around at PhD projects in North America, or just seeing what my colleagues were doing at the University of Minnesota, people are doing very, 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 very specific projects about species, like very, a primary molt of juvenile goldfinch feathers. Whereas for me, as so little is known about fish owls, my project was see what they do. It was very, very basic. And so the project that I started with the Sergeys was just to collect baseline data. And what we're doing now is mostly conservation to help protect the birds. But as far as other lines of research, I mean, it's wide open. I'm talking to several people now who have interest in doing graduate work on this species, and I'd love to have students come over there doing more, because I don't have time to personally do it myself. The Sergeys don't either. Where everything we do is with fish owls is based on the grants that we put together, and we don't do fish owls full time, but it's a passion project for me. It's a passion project for the Sergeys. So we get out every year to do things, but it's not. It's a shoestring budget operation.
Let's see. Matt asks, in your experience, to what extent has conservation been embraced by the people of the Primorsky Krai? Is that the right way to say it? And how does conservation factor into local politics and the relationship with Moscow? These are some pretty astute questions.
Yeah, yeah.
They're not plants, are they?
Well, so with the, I'll just talk about the logging company that we've been working with, or one of the ones that we've worked with in the past. They see the value in reducing access to some of these lands. They know that people are going in and poaching. They know people are going in and cutting down trees that would be their trees. So they're losing revenue because of these roads going in. So from a practical perspective, they're willing to work with us because it benefits their bottom line, and it makes them look good. The primary logging company there is majority owned by a Japanese company, and everyone wants to look good in the public eye. And so if you can say that we are closing down these roads after we're done with them, or we're not cutting down these big trees, or we're not building our roads through these high value areas for fish owls, they're not losing money in making those decisions, and they also look really good about it. So on that front, I would say conservation is embraced. But then, on an individual level, it can be harder. There are people who this one episode comes up in the book where this teenager shot and killed a fish owl because he wanted some meat for his sable traps, because he could get a couple bucks for a sable skin, and it just it didn't occur to him that a fish owl is more intrinsically valuable than a chicken running around his yard. And meat's meat. The meat presented itself. He shot the meat, took the meat, tried to catch sables with it, and he didn't care that it was endangered. So, I do think education of local communities is important, and getting communities involved in conservation. I think that's a big step. As far as I think the third part of that was the federal government in Moscow, and I would say recently the government under Putin. Putin's been good for conservation to some degree. He's strengthened laws about tiger conservation, so it's actually it's a felony now to possess tiger parts, whereas before it was just a misdemeanor. So there are the federal government is doing good things with respect to conservation.
It's a diplomatic answer. Amber,
I'm a diplomat's son.
Amber asks, can prey feel a change in the air when an owl flies overhead?
I don't know. When I'm looking down at a fish in a river, it knows I'm there, right? Like I'll move. I think I'm being sneaky, but it sees something, and so it moves away. So I'm sure they have some ability to recognize that owls are there. But also the way that owls hunt is that they'll sit on a rock or on the riverbank and just wait for something, sit there motionless and watching the water and wait for something to swim by, and then we'll jump in and catch it. So they're not flying around looking for a fish and then going down. They're just sitting there waiting.
Okay, let's see, I have a few more here. Stephen asks, is there much competition between fish owls and eagles for fish and different kinds of prey in that area?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Not really. They seem to split it up well. Because the eagles are hunting during the day, the eagles are taking daytime fish, and the fish owls are hunting when it's dark. And so they're not really competing at the same time. And also the eagles tend to stay closer to the coast, and the fish owls are more upriver. So there are slight differences in when they're hunting and the locations of where they're hunting. So I've never seen direct competition between the two.
This is a good question. What's your most memorable encounter with a fish owl? And can you tell us just some fun stories about those encounters?
Sure, let me think. So I think the moment where so there's a photo of me. I think it was on one of your promotional things where I'm holding this owl in my hands, and so that was an owl that we had caught the night before. And we design our traps to sort of keep the owls from not getting wet. But in this case, the owl got wet. We can't always help it. It was a very cold night. It was it was minus 30 something, And we weren't comfortable, releasing an owl into the wild, stressed from the capture, and then soaking wet as well. So we decided to better, we're going to put it in a box and we're going to keep it overnight, let it dry, and in the morning we'll feed it some fish and let it go. So that's what this photograph is. We've been feeding the owl some fish and we're about to let it go in the morning. But so that night, so we're getting ready for bed. That's one of these knocks on the door. And I showed a picture earlier in the presentation of these two kids who showed up looking to drink, low-grade ethanol. They were kind of out looking for a good time. And so these two kids just, we invited them in. They had a nice time. We drank a little bit. And the whole time, there's just this, this box with a giant owl in it that, they don't know is there. And so it's sort of this, every once in a while the owl would, scratch a little bit, and Sergey and Shurk and I would kind of, look at each other. Are these kids going to notice that we've got an owl in a box? But they never did. Then they left, and in the morning we let the owl go. So that was one. Another that I tell in the book, where I was not personally there, but it was at. So some of these trees that the owls nest in, again, they are just monsters. These monster cottonwoods, and if we see one with a hole in it, there's a good chance it's a fish owl nest. However, these same spaces are also shared by hibernating Asiatic black bears. So just by looking at it from down below, you can't always tell if you go up there what you're going to find. If you're going to find an owl or you're going to find a bear. And so one time, Shurk, who was our resident tree climber, Shurk and Sergey found this tree, like, absolutely, this is a fish owl nest. Shurk, go up and confirm. So Shurk's clambering up the tree. He likes to climb in his socks, by the way. He's most comfortable in his socks. So he gets up to the top and he's kind of yelling down his observations to Sergey. He's like, there's this hair up here. And so he throws down some hair. And so Sergey picks up this club and realizes that this is bear fur. And right then Shurk's like, there's this warm air coming out of here. And Sergey's like, get down! Because there've been a bear hibernating in this tree just relatively close to Shurk's just about to poke his face down into a bear den. So and I don't know, I feel like the book is full of good stories. I mean, the life over there is nuts. Fieldwork is full of eccentrics, and yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, let me conclude this wonderful conversation by saying in this glorious book, not only are there some excellent photographs, some of which you have not seen, in color, and a map, but there are some extensive notes in the back. So it's a wonderful book to read. I think, in my opinion, make a wonderful gift, too, for any conservationist or bird lover, or just person who loves adventure, or all of us who are missing travel. So, Jonathan, this has been an absolute delight. Spasiba.
Yeah, пожалуйста. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening. Please share this event with your family and friends, because I think it's a conversation that is really well worth having. Good night.